There's a kind of heartbreak no one talks about, not the kind that comes from losing someone, but the kind that comes from losing yourself, while trying to keep someone else, and that is the heartbreak most Sigma women know too well, because the most dangerous toxic relationship is not the one that hurts you, it's the one that slowly convinces you that the pain is normal, that the confusion is normal, that the exhaustion is normal, that constantly fixing, forgiving, and carrying everything is what love is supposed to look like, and that's how it begins, not with obvious destruction, but with subtle permission, permission to tolerate what you once would have rejected, permission to stay quiet when your soul wants to scream, permission to shrink, to make someone else comfortable, and little by little you disappear, not physically, internally. That's the heartbreak, not losing them, losing yourself. And Sigma women know this pain deeply, not because they are weak, but because they are strong enough to endure what most people would leave, strong enough to forgive what should never have been repeated, strong enough to keep hoping long after the relationship stopped being love. And that's the trap, because strength without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. Read that again. Strength without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. At first, it doesn't look toxic, it looks like patience, compromise, loyalty, understanding, the things the world praises. Be softer, be more understanding, be more forgiving, love harder, stay longer, try again, and for a while. It feels noble, it feels mature, it feels like strength, but there is a dangerous line between loving someone and abandoning yourself to keep them, and toxic people know exactly where that line is. That's what makes them dangerous, not because they always shout, not because they always betray loudly, but because they slowly train you to question your own reality, your standards, your instincts, your needs, your worth. And if you've ever been there, you know the feeling, the exhaustion of explaining yourself over and over, the anxiety of never knowing which version of them you'll meet today, the loneliness of sharing a bed with someone who feels emotionally absent. And isn't that one of the cruelest forms of pain, to be close to someone and still feel alone? That kind of loneliness changes you, it makes you adapt, makes you shrink, makes you become careful, careful with your words, careful with your emotions, careful with your truth, not because you stopped caring, but because caring became dangerous. And that's how toxic love works, not through one big betrayal, but through small repeated wounds, small dismissals, small manipulations, small silences, until one day you wake up and barely recognize yourself. That's the hidden violence of toxic love. It doesn't always bruise your body, sometimes it bruises your identity. And for Sigma women, that wound cuts deeper, because Sigma women are naturally independent, self-sufficient, emotionally resilient. They know how to stand alone, they do not need constant validation. And ironically, that's exactly why toxic people are drawn to them, because strong women carry something powerful: stability, depth, clarity, presence. And takers are always attracted to givers, not because they admire your strength, but because they benefit from it. They feed on your patience, your empathy, your emotional labor, your willingness to understand. And here is the cruel irony: the more you give, the less they value it, because what is always available eventually becomes invisible. That truth hurts, because you believed loyalty would build safety, but to the wrong person. Loyalty becomes convenience. You believed forgiveness would inspire change, but to the wrong person. Forgiveness becomes permission, and this is where Stoicism forces us to face something uncomfortable. Epictetus taught that suffering does not come from what happens, but from our attachment to what we hoped would happen. And that's what traps so many women. not the relationship itself, but the hope that they will change, hope that they will understand, hope that if you love harder, things will become what they once promised. But hope in the wrong place becomes a prison, and Sigma women often stay longer, because they can endure longer. They carry, adapt, forgive, hold everything together, until carrying pain becomes part of who they are. But hear this clearly: being able to carry pain does not mean you were meant to. Just because you can survive chaos doesn't mean you should live in it. That is where healing begins, not when they apologize, not when they regret, not when they finally understand. Healing begins the moment you tell yourself the truth. This was not love, not the kind that protects, not the kind that honors, not the kind that brings peace. Because real love does not make you smaller, it does not make you anxious, it does not make you feel like respect must be earned. And the moment you see that, everything changes, because now the question is no longer, how do I make this work? Now the question becomes, what part of me accepted less than I deserved? And that question changes lives, because the first step to reclaiming peace is not finding someone better, it's finding yourself again. And that begins with facing the hardest truth of all: sometimes they did not love you, they loved what you gave. And once you see that clearly, you stop chasing closure and start reclaiming power. In the next part, we'll face the brutal Stoic truth that sets Sigma women free: acceptance. Because healing does not begin when the relationship ends, it begins when the illusion does. The hardest part of leaving a toxic relationship is not the leaving, it's the seeing what was really there, not what you hoped was there, not what you prayed would be there, not what they promised would be there, but what was actually there. And that truth, for many Sigma women, does not arrive gently, it arrives like grief. Because when the chaos ends, when the messages stop, when the arguments go quiet, when the emotional storm finally settles, you are left with something heavier than loneliness, reality. And reality is brutal, because it asks you to face the truth, without the comfort of illusion, that maybe they never loved you the way you loved them, that maybe the future you fought so hard for only existed in your mind, that maybe the relationship you were trying to save was never truly holding you, only consuming you. And that realization hurts, not because truth is cruel, but because truth removes fantasy, and fantasy is often what kept you surviving. That fantasy that one day they would change, one day they would understand, one day they would finally love you the way you needed. But Stoicism asks a ruthless question: what if they already showed you who they are, and you kept loving who you hoped they would become? That question cuts deep, because hope can become a hiding place, a place where reality is delayed, a place where pain is tolerated in exchange for possibility. And possibility is dangerous when it keeps you trapped. That's where so many women get stuck, not in the relationship, but in resistance. Resistance to what happened, resistance to what they lost, resistance to what they now must admit, because admitting the truth means grieving the illusion, and grieving the illusion can feel worse than losing the person, because now you must accept something painful. You cannot fix what was never yours to fix. You cannot heal someone who was comfortable hurting you. You cannot love someone into becoming emotionally safe. And that truth breaks the fantasy, but it saves the self. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not wish things had happened differently, wish only to meet reality clearly." And that is what acceptance is, not approval, not agreement, clarity. Acceptance means, I see what this was, I see what this cost me, and I will not lie to myself anymore. That is power, because suffering deepens when you argue with reality. Think about how much pain comes from replaying, reanalyzing, rewriting conversations, searching for hidden meanings, trying to decode what they meant, trying to understand why they changed, why they pulled away, why they hurt you, why they could watch you break, and still ask for more. But some answers will never come, and some people will wound you without ever feeling guilty. That is one of life's hardest truths. Some people benefit from your confusion, from your patience, from your hope, and waiting for them to become the person you needed can destroy the person you are. That's why acceptance matters, because acceptance ends the waiting, it ends the bargaining, it ends the fantasy, and it forces you to ask, what exactly am I holding on to? The person, or the version of them, I created in my mind. Be honest, was it love, or was it potential? Because potential has trapped more people than reality ever did, and Sigma women often stay because they think, I've invested too much, I've stayed too long, I've fought too hard. But listen carefully, time invested does not make something valuable. A bad investment does not become wise just because you stayed longer. That truth changes lives, because many women confuse endurance with purpose. Just because you survived it doesn't mean you were meant to stay in it. That's the trap, the sunk cost of love. Staying because leaving would mean admitting you gave years to the wrong person, but walking away does not erase your love, it protects what remains of it, because your love was real, your effort was real, your intentions were real. Their inability to honor it does not reduce its value, it only reveals theirs. And here is the turning point. Healing begins, not when you stop missing them, but when you stop romanticizing them. That is a powerful difference, because missing someone does not mean they were good for you. Sometimes you miss familiarity, routine, attachment, hope, but familiarity is not safety, attachment is not love, hope is not evidence, and Stoicism teaches this clearly. See people as they repeatedly show themselves, not as they occasionally promise. Patterns tell the truth, not apologies, not speeches, not temporary change. Patterns. If disrespect was repeated, that was the truth. If manipulation was repeated, that was the truth. If betrayal was repeated, that was the truth. And acceptance means finally believing the evidence, not the excuses, because every time you accept less than peace, you train yourself to believe chaos is normal, but it isn't. Love should not feel like emotional survival. Love should not feel like walking on broken glass. Love should not make you question your own reality, and if it did, accepting that truth is the beginning of your freedom, not because acceptance feels good, but because it ends the war inside you, the war between what happened and what you wished had happened. And when that war ends, energy returns, clarity returns, peace begins to return. But acceptance alone is not enough, because even after truth becomes clear, many women still feel the urge to explain themselves, to make the other person understand, to make them finally see what they destroyed, and that urge keeps the wound open. In the next part, we'll talk about why stopping the explanation is the first real act of taking your power back. Acceptance gives you clarity, but clarity alone does not always set you free, because even after you finally see the truth, there is another trap waiting: the need to explain, to tell your side, to make them understand, to make them see what they did to you, to make them feel what you felt. And that urge feels natural, because pain wants recognition, Pain wants witness, pain wants balance, not revenge, understanding. You want them to say, I see it now, you were right, I hurt you, and maybe. You think. If they finally understand, the pain will make sense, but here is the truth, most Sigma women learn too late, their understanding is not required for your healing. Read that again, their understanding is not required for your healing, because waiting for it can become another form of attachment, and toxic people know this. They know that as long as you are still explaining, you are still emotionally available, still invested, still reachable, still hoping, and hope, when attached to the wrong person, becomes self-destruction. This is how manipulation often works, not by denying your pain, but by redirecting it. They hurt you. Then question your reaction, they betray you. Then call you dramatic, they neglect you. Then accuse you of asking for too much, and suddenly, the conversation is no longer about their behavior, it becomes about your emotions, your tone, your reaction, your overthinking, and that is how emotional manipulation traps you. It shifts the focus from what they did to how you responded, and if you are not careful, you will spend years trying to explain pain to the person who caused it, like handing evidence to a judge who already decided the verdict. There was a woman named Elena. For 11 years, she stayed in a marriage that looked stable from the outside, no screaming, no violence, no public chaos, and that's what made it harder, because toxic love is not always loud, sometimes it is quiet erosion. Every time Elena said she felt alone, her husband told her she was too emotional. Every time she expressed pain, he said she was too sensitive. Every time she asked for honesty, he accused her of creating problems, and so Elena explained, again, and again, and again, long conversations, careful words, late night tears, trying to be clearer, trying to be calmer, trying to find the perfect words that would finally make him understand, because she believed something dangerous. If I explain it well enough, he will change. But one night, after another exhausting conversation, she sat alone in her car, outside her own house, and for the first time, she asked herself something terrifying. What if he understands perfectly, and simply does not care? That question shattered everything, because sometimes the truth is not that they misunderstood you, sometimes the truth is, they understood you completely, and chose themselves anyway. That realization is painful, but it is liberating, because it changes the question, not, how do I explain better, but, why am I explaining my pain to someone committed to protecting their comfort? That question restores dignity, because the moment Elena stopped explaining, she started observing, and observation reveals what words often hide, patterns, and patterns never lie. She noticed how apologies never led to change, how understanding never led to effort, how promises always expired under pressure, and that's when the illusion broke. Epictetus taught, we cannot control how others receive truth, and that matters deeply, because a Sigma woman wastes her power trying to force awareness into someone committed to avoidance. Silence is not weakness. Silence is discernment. It is the refusal to keep bleeding in front of someone who keeps calling it drama. Think about that. How many nights did you spend rewriting messages, trying to sound calmer, kinder, clearer, more understandable, as if your pain needed better grammar to be valid? How much energy did you spend trying to be understood, instead of understanding what the pattern was already telling you? That's the trap, because many women think healing means one last conversation, one last explanation, one last message, one last attempt to be seen, but closure rarely comes through conversation. Especially with someone who benefited from your confusion, closure comes when you stop volunteering for emotional re-injury. That is power, to stop explaining, to stop defending, to stop proving, to stop translating your pain for people who used it against you. And here is a hard question: why seek peace from the source of your chaos? That question changes everything, because once you stop explaining, space opens: mental space, emotional space, spiritual space. At first, it feels strange, uncomfortable, like withdrawal, because chaos creates addiction too, the addiction of fixing, the addiction of hoping, the addiction of one more chance, and every time you break silence, you feed the cycle, but every time you hold silence, you break it. That is how power returns, not loudly, quietly, through restraint, through distance, through choosing yourself, without announcement. Months later, Elena left. No dramatic ending, no final speech, no long emotional goodbye, just clarity, just silence, just peace. And when someone later asked her, "What gave you the strength to leave?" she said, "I stopped trying to convince him that I was hurting, and started believing it myself." That is the shift. The moment your truth no longer needs permission, the moment your pain no longer needs validation, the moment your silence becomes self-respect. And once that happens, something powerful follows: absence, because healing is not only about what you stop saying, it is about who you stop giving access to. In the next part, we'll talk about the power of absence, and why disappearing from chaos is sometimes the loudest act of self-respect. The moment you stop explaining, something strange begins to happen. The noise starts to fade, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly. The endless mental rehearsals, the imaginary arguments, the urge to defend yourself, the need to be understood. Little by little, it loosens its grip, and in that silence, a truth begins to rise. Healing is not only about letting go of the person, it is about removing their access to your mind, because some relationships do not end. When the relationship ends, they continue in memory, in habit, in emotional reflex, in the way your nervous system still prepares for conflict, even when the room is empty. And that is why absence matters, not as punishment, as medicine, because distance reveals what closeness kept hidden. It shows you how much of your energy was being consumed just surviving their chaos, how much of your peace was spent anticipating their moods, how much of your life was organized around emotional survival. And here's the hard question: if someone is no longer in your life, why do they still have access to your emotional world? Why do their words still shape your mornings? Why do their memories still control your nights? Why does their absence still feel louder than your presence? That is not love anymore, that is imprint. And toxic relationships leave powerful imprints, not because they were deep, but because they were intense, and intensity is not the same as love. Read that again: intensity is not the same as love. Intensity feels like passion, like connection, like chemistry, but often it is instability, and the body remembers instability. It remembers waiting, guessing, walking on emotional eggshells. One good day, 3 painful ones, 1 apology, 5 repeated wounds, and somewhere in that cycle, you start confusing unpredictability with passion, chaos with love, anxiety with connection. But Stoicism teaches something sobering: what repeatedly disturbs your peace should not repeatedly enter your life. Seneca warned that constant exposure to disorder shapes the soul, and that is why absence matters, because what you repeatedly tolerate becomes your emotional climate. Stay in chaos long enough, and peace feels unfamiliar. Stay in disrespect long enough, and respect feels suspicious. Stay in emotional starvation long enough, and crumbs begin to feel like love. That's the danger, because when pain becomes familiar, familiarity disguises itself as safety. And here's the question: be honest. Did you miss them, or did you miss the version of yourself who kept hoping? That question changes everything, because often, it is not the person we miss, it is the dream, the possibility, the fantasy, that maybe this time, it would be different. But fantasy keeps wounds open, reality closes them. There was a woman named Myra. She ended a 7-year relationship, not because she stopped loving him, but because she realized love had become her excuse for staying. And after the breakup, she made one promise to herself: no contact, no checking his profile, no asking mutual friends, no just seeing how he's doing, no reopening the wound. At first, it felt unbearable, like withdrawal, because that's what breaking toxic attachment feels like: withdrawal. Her hand reached for her phone, dozens of times a day, to text, to check, to reconnect, to feel remembered. And isn't that one of the deepest pains after heartbreak? Not just losing someone, but fearing that all your love meant nothing, fearing you were replaceable, disposable, forgettable. But ask yourself this: if someone only valued you while you were available, was that love, or was it access? That question hit Myra hard, and it changed how she saw everything. Week by week, silence changed shape. At first, it felt like emptiness, then it felt like relief, and then it became clarity. One morning, almost 3 months later, she sat at her kitchen table, drinking coffee, and suddenly, she noticed something: no anxiety, no emotional heaviness, no tension in her chest, no dread, just stillness. And it shocked her, because for years, stillness had disappeared from her life. And that's when she understood, peace had been missing, long before the relationship ended. That realization changed everything, because peace feels unfamiliar to people who have lived too long in survival mode. And that is why so many go back, not because the relationship was healthy, but because chaos felt familiar, and familiar feels safe. Even when it is destroying you, that is the trap. Sigma women must understand this deeply. Absence is not losing, absence is detox. It is the nervous system learning safety again. It is the heart learning that love does not have to hurt to feel real. It is the mind remembering what calm feels like. And that is why disappearing matters: not to make them miss you, not to make them regret losing you, not to prove your worth, but to make yourself visible to yourself again. Because when someone has occupied your emotional world for too long, their absence creates space, and space is sacred. Space allows truth to settle, memory to soften, identity to return, without interruption, without manipulation, without confusion. So if you are in that stage now, missing them, checking on them, wondering if silence is too harsh, ask yourself, was your presence healing you, or draining you? Was staying making you stronger, or smaller? Was love expanding your peace, or consuming it? Because your answers will tell you the truth. And if distance feels painful, good. Pain often means the attachment is breaking, and attachment breaking is how freedom begins. But what happens after the silence? What happens when the emotional fog clears? For many Sigma women, Something unexpected appears, solitude, and most people fear solitude, but what if solitude was never the punishment? What if it was the reward? In the next part, we'll talk about why being alone may be the most healing thing that ever happens to you. After distance does its work, after the noise fades, after the emotional fog begins to lift, after your nervous system stops waiting for the next wound, something unexpected enters your life. Silence, not the silence of tension, not the silence after an argument, not the silence used as punishment, a different kind, clean silence, safe silence, the kind of silence that asks nothing from you, and for many Sigma women, this is the strangest part of healing, because after years of emotional chaos, peace can feel empty, and emptiness can feel terrifying. Why? Because when you've spent years orbiting someone else's emotions, their moods, their needs, their instability, stillness feels unnatural, like something is missing, and in a way, something is: the chaos, the emotional noise, the constant fixing, the hypervigilance, the adrenaline. And here is the truth: most people are never told when chaos leaves. Your body may mistake peace for loneliness. That is why so many go back, not because they miss the person, but because they miss the pattern, the emotional cycle, the tension, the hope, the relief, the repeat, and repeated long enough. That cycle becomes familiar, and familiar can feel like safety, even when it is hurting you. That is the hidden trap, because toxic love does not just break your heart, it rewires your normal, and when normal changes, peace feels foreign. But ask yourself this: what if the discomfort of being alone is not emptiness, but healing? What if the silence you fear so much is actually where your life begins again? That is the hidden gift of solitude, not abandonment, recovery. There was a woman named Claire. After 19 years of marriage, she divorced quietly. No scandal, no betrayal, no dramatic collapse, just years of emotional starvation, years of being physically present in a relationship, but emotionally invisible, years of carrying everything, holding everything together, being the center of a home that never poured back into her. And when it ended, people pitied her. They said, "You must feel so alone." But Claire said something that changed everything. For the first time in 20 years, I can hear myself think. That line says everything, because solitude after toxic love is not the loss of company, it is the return of self. And isn't that what was missing all along? Not them, you, the version of you that existed before survival became identity, before compromise became habit, before self-abandonment became normal. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you sat alone and felt safe, not distracted, not scrolling, not numbing, just present, just still, just okay? Can you remember, or has survival been your emotional baseline for so long that peace feels unfamiliar? That's what toxic love steals, not just happiness, safety, inner safety. It teaches your body that unpredictability is intimacy, that emotional inconsistency is normal, that love must be earned through endurance. But Stoicism rejects that completely. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself often: retreat into yourself, not to escape life, but to restore yourself. And that is what solitude becomes, a return inward, a sacred place, where your identity stops competing with someone else's dysfunction, where your worth is no longer negotiated, where your energy is no longer extracted, where your time belongs to you again. And something powerful happens there. At first, you grieve, not always the person, often the dream, The future you imagined, the life you believed, would eventually happen, and grief matters, because grief clears illusion, it forces fantasy, to make room for truth, and truth, while painful, is clean, unlike false hope, but then, slowly, something changes, you sleep better, breathe deeper, think clearer, you laugh, without checking who's watching, you make choices, without fear of conflict, you exist, without managing someone else's emotional weather, and doesn't that sound like freedom, not dramatic freedom, real freedom, quiet freedom, the kind that doesn't need to be seen, to be felt? Claire said something else. 4 years after her divorce, these have been the most peaceful years of my life. Think about that, not the marriage, not the relationship, the years after. Why? Because peace is not created by being chosen, peace is created by choosing yourself. That is the lesson solitude teaches. Your life does not begin when someone loves you, it begins when you stop abandoning yourself. And Sigma women grow powerfully in solitude, because unlike those who seek identity in company, Sigma women rebuild in silence. They reflect, observe, strengthen, reclaim, quietly, deeply, honestly. And here is the deeper question: what if the relationship ending was not your loss, but your release? What if what felt like rejection was actually redirection? What if being alone is where your strongest self returns? Because many women fear solitude as proof of failure, but what if staying in chaos was the real failure? What if leaving was the victory? What if peace was the reward? Because that is what solitude gives you: perspective, clarity, space, and space changes everything. It lets you see patterns, see truths, see yourself. But peace without boundaries does not last, and many women, after healing, make the same mistake again, not because they didn't heal, but because they never rebuilt standards, and without standards, old chaos finds new ways back in. In the next part, we'll talk about the non-negotiable boundaries a Sigma female must build if she never wants chaos to enter her peace again. Solitude gives you space, space to breathe, space to think, space to hear yourself again, but space alone does not protect peace, because peace is fragile when it has no standards guarding it. And this is where many women make the same mistake: they heal, but they leave the door unlocked. They become wiser, stronger, more self-aware, but when something familiar returns, they open the door, not because they are weak, but because they are compassionate, open-hearted, hopeful, and those qualities are beautiful, until they are unprotected, because healing without boundaries is like rebuilding your home and leaving the windows open during a storm. Sooner or later, the damage returns. That's why after toxic love, the question is not, am I ready to love again? The real question is, am I ready to protect myself differently? That question changes everything, because boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They do not block love, they block chaos, they block confusion, they block repeated disrespect. And Sigma women must understand this. If your peace cost you years to rebuild, why would access to it be easy? Think about that. Why do we protect money better than energy? Why do we protect schedules better than emotional peace? Why do we say no to strangers, but yes to disrespect? That is the old pattern, and patterns repeat until boundaries interrupt them. There was a woman named Naomi. After leaving a deeply manipulative relationship, she spent 2 years alone, healing, reading, walking, rebuilding routines, learning what calm felt like again, and eventually, she met someone new, At first, everything felt different, healthier, softer, safer. He was attentive, present, interested, and for a while, Naomi thought, maybe this is what healthy love feels like. But then, small things appeared, nothing dramatic, no obvious betrayal, just patterns. He disappeared after conflict, returned with charm, avoided accountability, shifted blame subtly, and here is what matters, the old Naomi would have explained, waited, excused, doubted herself, given more time, given more understanding, but this Naomi, she noticed, and that is the difference. Healing does not make you perfect, it makes you observant, and observation is where boundaries begin, not when you speak, when you see. Ask yourself, how many red flags did you once call patience? How many warnings did you call love? How many times did your body feel unsafe, but your mind kept negotiating? That matters, because your body often knows, before your mind accepts. The tightness in your chest, the anxiety after simple conversations, the overthinking, the emotional exhaustion, the feeling of walking carefully, those are signals, and Stoicism teaches awareness before reaction. Epictetus taught that wisdom begins by seeing things clearly, not beautifully, not hopefully, clearly, and boundaries are built on clarity, not chemistry, not attraction, not potential, reality, reality first. That is the Sigma standard. Naomi noticed the pattern, and instead of over-explaining, she asked one clear question, calmly, directly, and his response told her everything: avoidance, deflection, no accountability, and in that moment, she understood something powerful. A person's reaction to accountability reveals their capacity for love. That truth changed her, because love without accountability is not safety, it is risk. Weeks later, he came back, apologetic, convincing, promising change, and that is where many women fall, not in the beginning, at the return, because old wounds still recognize familiar voices, and familiar pain can still feel tempting, but healed boundaries do not trust promises, they trust patterns. Read that again. Healed boundaries do not trust promises, they trust patterns, because anyone can speak beautifully, anyone can sound sorry, anyone can promise change, but character is proven through consistency, not emotion, not words, consistency, and that becomes your new standard. Naomi walked away, quietly, without anger, without performance, without needing to explain, and when someone later asked her, "Did it hurt?" she said, "Yes, but not as much as betraying myself again." That line is everything, because boundaries often hurt at first. Why? Because boundaries force you to disappoint others instead of disappointing yourself, and if you spent years overgiving, that will feel unnatural, but unnatural does not mean wrong, it means new, and new is how healing becomes permanent. Here is the Sigma rule: if it costs your peace, it costs too much. Simple, clear, non-negotiable, and this is how boundaries become real. If communication creates confusion, pause. If accountability is missing, step back. If respect is inconsistent, leave. If peace disappears, pay attention, because peace is data. Read that again. Peace is data. If someone enters your life, and your nervous system returns to chaos, that is information, not something to ignore, not something to fix. Information. And healed Sigma women no longer negotiate with repeated disrespect. They observe, decide, move quietly, without guilt, without explaining, without asking permission, because the strongest boundary is not spoken, it is enforced. And once boundaries are strong, something changes. You stop building your life around avoiding pain, and start building it around protecting peace. That is where the inner fortress begins, not a wall against love, but a foundation within yourself that no one can shake. And in the next part, we'll build that fortress, because true healing is not becoming harder, it is becoming unshakable. Boundaries protect your peace, but eventually, peace must become more than something you protect, it must become something you carry, because here is the truth: no boundary can save you. If your inner world still depends on being chosen, no distance can protect you. If your worth still rises and falls with someone else's attention, no silence can heal you. If deep inside you still believe love must be earned through suffering, and that is the deeper work, not just keeping the wrong people out, but becoming so rooted within yourself that their presence no longer determines your value, that is the inner fortress. And this is where Stoicism becomes real, not as philosophy, as survival. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself constantly. Not because life was easy, but because he understood something powerful: if the mind is weak, the world feels unbearable, but if the mind is trained, the world loses its power to break you. That is the fortress, not becoming cold, not becoming hard, not becoming unreachable. A fortress is not a prison, it is stability, a place inside you, where your worth is no longer up for negotiation. And after toxic love, that matters more than ever, because toxic relationships train you to measure your value through someone else's behavior. If they are warm, you feel worthy; if they pull away, you feel anxious; if they approve, you feel safe; if they criticize, you collapse. That is not love, that is dependence, and dependence makes you vulnerable to anyone who knows how to manipulate affection. So here is the uncomfortable question: who are you without their approval? Who are you without being needed? Who are you without proving your worth? Who are you when no one is choosing you except you? That question is terrifying, because for many women, the relationship became the mirror, and when the mirror broke, so did the image. There was a woman named Iris. After ending a toxic engagement, she spent months doing what many people do: working, staying busy, distracting herself, looking fine. But every night, when the silence returned, so did the same question: was I not enough? And isn't that the real wound? Not that they left, but that their leaving made you question yourself. That is how emotional damage works, not always through cruelty, sometimes through repetition, neglect repeated, distance repeated, disrespect repeated, until your mind starts writing conclusions your heart never deserved. Iris thought moving on meant moving towards someone new, a new relationship, a new distraction, a new reassurance. But one day, her grandmother told her something that changed her life. She said, "If your peace can be taken by someone leaving, then your peace was never truly yours." That sentence stayed with her, and maybe it needs to stay with you too, because real peace cannot depend on what can leave. Not a person, not attention, not validation, not love. Real peace must be rooted deeper, and that is when Iris understood. Healing was not about replacing the person, it was about rebuilding the self, and rebuilding the self requires something most people avoid: stillness, honesty, self-confrontation, no distractions, no emotional substitutes, no new attachment to cover old wounds, just truth. What did this relationship teach me? Where did I abandon myself? What pain made me tolerate what I knew was wrong? What emptiness made crumbs feel like enough? Those questions are painful, but they build strength, because the fortress is built through truth, not avoidance. Stoicism teaches that pain can refine you, if you let it teach you. Not every painful season was sent to destroy you. Some seasons reveal where your self-worth was outsourced, and once you see that, you can reclaim it, piece by piece, decision by decision, promise by promise. Iris started small: morning walks, reading alone, cooking for herself, keeping promises to herself. And isn't that how healing really begins? Not in grand transformations, but in small acts of self-loyalty, because every promise you keep to yourself restores trust, and trust in yourself is the foundation of the fortress. Think about that. How many promises did you keep for others, while breaking every promise to yourself? How often did you show up for everyone, while abandoning your own needs? That ends now, because the Sigma female, who heals deeply, does not become harder to love, she becomes harder to disturb. That is the shift. She still loves, still feels, still opens her heart, but never again at the cost of herself, never again at the cost of peace. And this is the final transformation. Before, love was the standard; now, peace is the standard. Before, chemistry was enough; now, consistency matters. Before, attention felt like value; now, character decides access. That is the fortress, a life rooted in inner truth, not external approval. And once you build that, something powerful happens. You stop fearing loss, because loss can no longer destroy what is rooted inside you. That is freedom, not freedom from pain, freedom from dependence, freedom from needing what can leave. And maybe that is what this journey was always trying to teach you, not how to hold on, but how to return to yourself. If this video spoke to a part of you that is still healing, or reminded you of what you had forgotten, subscribe to Stoic Havenway, not for motivation, not for noise, but for clarity, for reminders, for the kind of truth that helps you rebuild what life once shook. And if you stayed until this moment, thank you, truly, thank you for your time, your attention, and your courage to face difficult truths. If any part of this felt like your story, leave a comment below, not to explain, not to justify, just to remind yourself, you survived, you learned, and now, you are becoming someone who will never abandon herself again. Protect your peace, trust your healing, and remember, sometimes the woman you become after heartbreak is the woman you were always meant to be.